For 16 years, from 1989 through 2004, Booknotes was C-SPAN's signature author interview program. Focusing exclusively on contemporary nonfiction, the Booknotes series created an unparalleled television forum for writers of history, biography, politics, and public and cultural affairs. The Booknotes format was simple: one author, one book, 1 hour. For a full hour every Sunday night, 52 weeks a year, nonfiction writers were asked to discuss their most recent work. Beyond the book's subject matter, authors were also queried about their research, their writing process, and their own lives and influences. The result is a body of televised interviews that serve as a lasting scholarly resource for authors, researchers, students, readers, and educators. George Mason University Libraries is now adding to this trove of information by re-interviewing selected authors about their experiences as part of the Booknotes series.
Today is May 2nd, 2014, and we are interviewing Kenneth Ackerman, who appeared on Booknotes on July 27th, 2003, to discuss his book, Dark Horse, The Surprise Election and Political Murder of James A. Garfield.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, Mr. Ackerman.
Good morning.
How did your book come to be on Booknotes?
Well, first, thank you for having me here for this oral history. I appreciate it very much. How did my book get to be on Booknotes? The honest answer is I really don't know. And in fact, when it happened, I was somewhat surprised. At that point in 2003, when the book came out, I was not a well-known writer. This was my first book since 1988. When I wrote a book called The Gold Ring about Jay Gould and Jim Fisk cornering the gold market in New York in 1869. So this is my first book in about 15 years. I was working as a lawyer at the time. And I didn't know how the book was going to go over. The publisher was Carroll and Graf. They were part of the Avalon Group. So an established publisher, and they did a good job of getting the book out for reviews and for appearances. But when this came up, I was a little surprised because I had been watching Booknotes for a long time just as a viewer. I was very familiar with the show, and I knew it was very prestigious to be on it, so I was very happy about it. But a little surprised because I didn't know that I always assumed a show like that would look for well-known people. And this was my first book in a very long time, and so I wasn't really a well-known person. But evidently the publicist at the publishing house had circulated it to C-SPAN, among other places, and Brian Lamb, I believe, made the choices himself for this, or him and a very small staff. And they picked it.
And how did you prepare for your appearance?
Well, I prepared a lot for the appearance, actually. As I said, I'd watched the show for some time, so I was familiar with it. But knowing that you're going to be on it, and I think I had about a month's notice. There were at least a few weeks' notice. So I watched the show a few times in a very kind of clinical way. Watching what kind of, really noticing what kind of questions Brian Lamb would ask and how he would mix up the questions and how he would go from very big picture to very, very minor detail. He would skip around from stories in the book to stories about your life to how you function as a writer. So I did, my background as a lawyer in Washington and being involved in the political world is I've appeared many times before congressional hearings and media in that world. And so I've always been used to, if I know I have an appearance, to practice, to do a session. So for this, I asked my nephew, who's a writer also. He's a professor at George Washington University. His name is Jim Hirschberg. I'll plug his book. He had a very good book, came out last year, called Marigold, The Last Chance for Peace in Vietnam. But we spent a Sunday morning where he played Brian Lamb and peppered me with questions. The other thing I did, and for this interview, I pulled out my notes on it just to see what they looked like. I knew that he asked a lot of very detailed questions. And so I wrote myself a cheat sheet of just little details that I thought might come up during the conversation. For instance, I noticed that he always he asked how old were people at certain key points. And my book very much revolves around the year 1880, 1881, when James Garfield is nominated for president at the 36th ballot convention in Chicago and then is assassinated the next year. So I made a point to write a list of how old was everyone in 1880, all of the key people who figure in the story, plus a lot of just dates and how many delegates were at the convention, how many electoral votes did you need to win the presidency back then. Just a lot of details that I thought could come up in the interview. And that was just a piece of paper that I would look at that morning, the day before, so those facts would be at my fingertips.
So surprisingly, those notes look exactly like the notes in the margins of the book.
Yes,
that
well,
Brian Lamb would write.
Yes.
What do you remember most about your appearance on the program? And I'd really like to know, did they record it live, or did they record it live at 9 p.m.?
Oh, no. No, they recorded it. It was on a weekday, I believe. They recorded it during the day, so it was taped. Right. But it was taped very much the way you saw it. Mm-hmm. We would go into the studio, they'd set you up. I had never met Mr. Lamb before, so I had no, we hadn't really met. I didn't really, there was no chance for an icebreaker conversation beforehand. Sure. We just started right in. And it went for 50 minutes and no cuts. It's you and him with a dark background. If you make a mistake, there's no place to hide. So you just roll with it. And I do remember that the time seemed to go quickly. I was a little nervous at the beginning because it was a new experience. I tried to, as we were setting up before the camera started, to get in my, thank you, Mr. Lamb, for inviting me to the show, and he was very gracious. Mm-hmm. But then as soon as the lights were on, or as soon as the camera started, he started right in.
Very good. Booknotes' hour-long format differed greatly from most of the network television interviews, which last 3 minutes or less. What do you think are the benefits and or drawbacks of this longer format for the author and for the viewer?
Well, I was thinking about that when I saw your question. It's easy to say, well, it's obviously better because it's because there's more time to get to talk, but I don't know that that's necessarily so. I think part of the reason that it worked was the way that Brian Lamb would control the hour. Mm-hmm. If you had a poor interviewer, it's very easy to see a writer simply going off on tangents and getting lost in that hour and having a very disjointed conversation for a long period. You need someone to run it, who really understands the book and understands the structure of the interview. Watching it just the other day in preparation for this morning, what struck me about it was how Brian Lamb controlled the interview. When you watch it, he seemed to be jumping back and forth between topics and going in for the narrow details and then going back for a broad picture. But still, he had a concept of how the interview was going to go, what he wanted to cover, how he wanted to cover it, and he led it. I never got to see the actual scribbles in the book. I was somewhat struck. Usually, when someone interviews you, they have a typed out piece of paper with a list of questions, something like that, or else notes in a notebook. He had in his lap a copy of the book. I saw him open it up, and I saw that there were scribbles all over the where he had his handwritten notes. He had obviously not just read the book, but really studied it. He knew what was in it. Right. He didn't. Some interviewers will try to tell the story themselves, to make it about them, right. Because they have natural egos, which sometimes get in the way. But what's interesting about Brian Lamb is that he's a very skilled interviewer, a very skilled reporter. Everything is a question. He obviously knows the answers to the questions as he's asking them, but he is putting it on you as the writer to tell your own story. There were several points where I saw him wanting me to talk about a particular incident of the book, but rather than telling the story and asking me to comment on it, he would lead into it like, so who is John Logan? Right. What was John Logan doing in March of 1881? Mm-hmm. Question after question, and that way pointing you in a direction through your answers, but putting it on you, the writer, to tell the story. And that does a number of things in an interview. For one thing, you never know when you're going to get an unexpected answer. And it also makes it about the writer, not the interviewer.
Right, very good. Judging by the extensive marginalia in the book, Mr. Lamb read them thoroughly before the interview. Do you find this to be normal for interviewers?
Oh, not at all.
Now, does it change the interview experience?
Oh, very much. Because he knows what he wants to cover. It kind of struck me, and I was talking to my wife about this last night, that for Brian Lamb, when he's doing an interview like this, there's a front story and a back story. At the same time, he is doing his Booknotes interviews every Sunday night. The other days of the week, he is running C-SPAN.
Right.
And two very formidable jobs when you think about it. I mean, just the time involved in reading a full-length nonfiction book every week and really studying it and thinking through and how to do an hour-long interview on it. But at the same time, he's very involved in the politics of the day. I mean, C-SPAN is not simply putting cameras on the House on the floor of the House and Senate, which is a pretty significant thing in itself, but it's making a statement. It's bringing democracy to the people. I know, having talked to him once or twice after then, the amount of work and strategy and thought that went into not simply the coverage of the House and Senate floor, but of conference committees, for instance, or committee markups, exactly. Or choosing what to cover, and having a sense of what the politics was behind it, having a sense of the institution. And I think when he looks at his history, particularly political history, which he covers a lot of on Booknotes and Book TV, I think he's looking at it through both of those lenses. For instance, in my book, I talk a lot about, the book itself is about James Garfield and the assassination and the events leading up to it and the politics leading up to it. The story takes place in Washington, and the key players are senators and congressmen, cabinet members, and what was going on at the time. And he spent a lot of time in the interview asking me about how the Senate worked back then. What was secret and what wasn't? What were the executive sessions? Well, why was it different? What was the impact, for instance, of the members being elected by state legislatures rather than voters? Why it was that so much of what the Senate did was behind closed doors? Was it really true that they didn't have public hearings, or that any discussion of a nominee was off the record? How did people ever find out how members voted? A lot of these procedural questions, which to him I think were interesting, not simply for the history, but because he was wrestling with these things day in and day out running C-SPAN.
Sure, and that gets at the heart of why we read and write history, is to compare it to our modern day. So Mr. Lamb asked about an author's research and writing methods. Do you believe that the reading public finds these details about the practice of writing interesting? And do you think other authors and publishers find them interesting as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this was part of what made Book TV and Booknotes so important. It really changed the way nonfiction book writing worked. And very much he did to nonfiction books very much what he did to Congress. In a sense, by getting writers on camera for an hour and having them talk not only about what's in their book, but who they are and how they came to write the book and what their writing habits were, and talk about their research and what they looked at and what they did. He demystified it. As a writer, you now are talking to your readers and explaining what you do. You're not hiding behind the mystique of, I am a writer, therefore, the mystique is broken. Instead, he has me there as telling people, well, how long did it take me to do my first draft? When I looked at Charles Guiteau, there was one question that actually caught me on something on research. Charles Guiteau is the assassin who shoots James Garfield. Arguably, the doctors killed him, but he's the one who pulled the trigger and hung for it. And his body was never buried. Instead, after he was hanged, they did an autopsy because there was a big question about insanity in that case. He was never found insane, but the general public believed he probably was. But his body was never buried, and his bones were kept at a museum. And Ryan Lamb asked, "So did you go see the bones?" And actually, I did not, because that wasn't where I was going in my book. There are other people who have. You know, there are a couple of other books about the Garfield assassination that look at these medical issues. That wasn't where I was, and so I acknowledged it. And I think it's interesting for readers to know what writers know, what they look at, what they don't look at, how they came to write the book, how it fit into their private lives, what they do when they're not writing. So yes, I thought that was very important, and it made Booknotes very much I know a lot of writers watched the show, just to learn technique and to learn from other writers.
So, building on that, Mr. Lamb frequently asked his guests biographical questions. Did that surprise you? And is that generally different from most author interviews you've experienced?
Well, a lot of other interviewers will ask biographical questions if they have time in the 3 minutes. I thought the way he did it, though, was somewhat different than others, because it was more, it wasn't simply finding some cute fact for a headline. It was more, he was more trying to show his viewers what the writer knows about the topic. I know it's a basic thing when for writers, when you pitch a book, when you present a book, one of the things you have to explain to a publisher is why you're the right person to write the book. What is there in your life experience that gives you knowledge of this subject? And so when he asks you about this, part just he's looking at as a journalist for human interest. What's your background? Do you have kids? Are you married? That kind of thing. But he was also he asked me. I know. He asked me about my background in Washington, what I knew from my work experience about Capitol Hill, how that allowed me to talk about the political build-up to the Garfield assassination, a lot of which involved politics, a fight over a Senate nominee. In this case, it was the collector of the Port of New York. That was the big fight at the time. That led to Roscoe Conkling's confrontation with James Garfield, which Garfield won, resulting in Conkling resigning right around the time that Charles Guiteau, who kind of identified with Conkling and the Stalwarts, around the time he lost his bid to be consul to Paris. So all of this was going on at the same time. But he made a point to have me talk about the fact that I had worked on Capitol Hill in the Senate under 2 different senators, one Republican, one Democrat, over many years, and had worked on some of these issues, had worked on nominations, that gave me credentials to talk about the issue.
And we as readers love that because it's seeing something completely different.
Right.
But you at the same time were able to explain about what Congress was like at the time. That was something that struck me about the book, was that everyone was wearing their uniforms still, and that they were addressing each other by their military rank, not by their congressional.
Yes, the story took place in 1880 and 1881, which was just 15 years at the end of the Civil War. At the time, it was much more a status symbol to have been a general in the Army, you're a colonel in the Union Army, than to have been a political figure. If you had the choice between president or governor or general, you took general. Everyone called Grant General Grant, even though he was a former president, because that was the more prestigious title.
Right, and of course you had the 2 characters, Conkling and Blaine, neither of whom
served in the Army, and they were the leading politicians.
Exactly. So that there was, that was one of the fun things about your book, was that there was these interesting dynamics of the politics and the military played out against each other. We've already got about any surprises. The skeleton question was really strange.
Well, I'll tell you one that did surprise me a little bit. He made a point to have me describe that there were 3 or 4 affairs in the book, and they were important because they were important to the story, actually, as well as to understanding who the people were. Roscoe Conkling was married, and he had a secret romance with Kate Chase Sprague, who was the wife of a governor, a very well-known woman at the time, to the point where he visited her at one point at their home in Rhode Island. And while he was there with Mrs. Sprague, Mr. Sprague came home and had to chase him out of the house with a shotgun. And this became known into the newspapers and was a big story and was part of the legend of Roscoe Conkling at the time. And he had me explain that in some detail. He had me explain there was another situation where Tom Platt, a senator from New York, later he would become the boss of the New York State Machine, but at this point he was a relatively young senator. He was Roscoe Conkling's protege, I guess is the word. And at one point when they were trying to win a point at the New York State Legislature in Albany, and Conkling and Platt were in Albany in the same hotel with all the state legislators, a woman walked into the hotel and spent the night with Mr. Platt, and his political enemies found out about it, and they brought a stepladder over to his hotel room so that they could all climb up and look in the window over the front door at the 2 of them in bed, and that became known to the newspaper men and was disclosed the next morning. And it was important to the story because it wasn't just a funny story, but this was the day before the Garfield assassination, and the issue in Albany was very much related to the assassination. But it was interesting that he had me tell those particular stories. Mm-hmm. I think he just appreciated them as a journalist.
Sure. You watched Booknotes before. Mm-hmm. Did your experience on the show change your impression of it?
I guess a little bit. I was somewhat more sympathetic to the writers afterward. It's a challenging format. I think it's a good format. I mean, I enjoyed it. You have to be on your toes. You have to know your material. You have to prepare for it. People have the impression that if you write a book that you obviously remember everything that's in those 400 pages, mm-hmm. and you don't. At the time that I was on the interview, I had done most of the work on the book about 6 months to a year before. So you really have to go back and learn your own book to make sure that if he asks you detailed questions, that you have them on your fingertips. But it also means that if you make a mistake, and everyone makes mistakes, there's no place to hide. You have to own up to them. If there's something you don't know, you just have to acknowledge, I don't know, and move on. And he's not someone who will pin you down and give you a hard time, but I did notice that it was apparent that there were some authors who would get off on the wrong track and would be uncomfortable until they got themselves back on track.
Sure. The Booknotes series focused entirely on nonfiction books published between mm-hmm. the late 1980s and 2004. Mm-hmm. What do you think might be the advantages of having a collection of these 800 books with this particular focus?
Well, there are a lot of very good books during that period, but I think also Booknotes, and I talked about this a little before, but Booknotes in conjunction with Book TV very much changed the world of nonfiction book writing. It made it much more open. It made it much more accessible for nonfiction book writers. It was very empowering for book writers. Suddenly, you didn't have to do a 30-city tour in order to be visible in 30 cities. Today, it's standard that when a book comes out, one of the things that the publisher or self-publisher these days, because the business has changed so much, is you try to plan an event or 2 or 3 events early on that are designed for Book TV, mm-hmm. Whether it's Politics and Prose in Washington or some venue that would be suitable for Book TV. And that's central to the publicity campaign for any book. Sure. that period, I think, saw a real change in book writing as a result. It changed the business. It changed the way writers go about publicizing their books. It changed what the public expects of book writers. Today, well, I mentioned how the hour-long format demystifies the writer. It forces the writer to be much more upfront with the reading public. Mm-hmm. Today, that attitude is carried forward in the newer technology. Every writer, for instance, today has a web page where they talk about not only their books, but also who they are, what their likes and dislikes. A lot of writers have blogs and social networks to be more intimate and closer to their readers. And that trend, I think, really started with Book TV and Booknotes, which put writers up there closer to their readers and took them out from behind the curtain.
Wonderful. I had never thought of it that way, but yeah, it was that middle step.
Yeah.
Between. Brian Lamb had a rule that authors could only appear on the program
Mm-hmm.
one time,
Right.
sometimes to the detriment of the authors, because the book that they
Right.
featured was not their best book.
Right.
And some of them it was, and it was so
Mm-hmm.
it was very good for them. If asked, would you return?
Oh, of course I'd return. But I saw you had written down that question, and I thought that was a very important rule, and that it was a very positive thing, because it prevented book notes from becoming stale, and it prevented. It's very tempting if you're producing a show like that to simply go to the well-known writers,
Yes.
or to simply go, a writer who has 3 or 4 or 5 bestsellers, to simply have them on 4 or 5 times, which crowds out everyone else. And I thought by what he did, by limiting writers to one shot, they could be on Book TV for their other books. It certainly didn't crowd them out that way, but it meant that he was always looking for new people, and it made it much more democratic with a small d, in terms of a much wider view, a much wider range of writers who appeared. So I thought it was a very good rule. It kept the show from getting stale.
Mm-hmm. Was there a difference in sales or national attention for your book after you discussed it with Brian Lamb?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a short-term thing and a long-term thing. There's my agent had a word for it. I don't think it was just him. That there's the day after you're on Book TV or Booknotes, there's the C-SPAN spike, and in the sense that your minute by minute or hour by hour ranking on Amazon.com would go up during that hour, and usually the next day it would linger there for a few days. So there was that short-term impact because of the terrific exposure you were getting. It's a self-selecting audience. The people who watch Book TV are people who are interested in books and would be very likely to jot down the name and either go on Amazon or go to a bookstore, because they're people who are looking for books to read and who enjoy books. So it's a great audience to have. And Booknotes, you're on for a full hour, so you get very good exposure. For longer term, the impact it had for me was suddenly I gave my book a good amount of credibility. As I said, I was not a well-known writer at the time. It was my first book in about 15 years. So I wasn't really on the map at the time it came out. There were 2 things that were the things that made that book. One was Brian Lamb's interview on C-SPAN that came out right around the time the book was being published. And then about a week later, on NPR's All Things Considered, did a very interesting piece on it as well. And those 2 things were basically what put the book on the map.
Did your experience with Booknotes cause you to rethink any of your own approaches or assumptions regarding your research or writing?
I'm not sure on that question. I've always tried to be very strategic in research, and I guess the show reinforced it in the sense that your actual writing of the book is not something that happens in a vacuum. It's part of your story. Mm-hmm. The research is part of your story. How you came on the story that you wrote about is part of the book. Many books do that in a very self-conscious way. the first chapter is as the writer talking about themselves and how they came on the story. But even if you don't do it, even if you as the writer are not part of your own book, still it's part of the story that you tell. And I think he forced me and others as writers to think in those terms.
Very good. What have you been working on after this book, and what books are you most pleased with?
Well, the books I'm most pleased with, at this point I have four commercial books that I've written. Dark Horse worked out well enough that I wrote basically three right after the other.
Mm-hmm.
Dark Horse, then my biography of Boss Tweed came out about 2 years later, and then my book Young J. Edgar about J. Edgar Hoover and the Palmer raids right after World War I came out about 2 years after that. So it got me on quite a run. After the Hoover book came out in 2007, 2008, since then I've slacked off a little bit. I've been more concentrating on my day job as a lawyer. I have stayed involved in the book world. About a year ago, I got back the rights to all 4 of my books and set up my own publishing entity. And so now I'm something called Viral History Press, right. Which is connected to a history blog that I write. And so I now publish all 4 of my own books through Viral History Press. It worked out partly because my books were all published just as the industry was changing. Mm-hmm. They were all published in a non-digital form. Right. So when after the Hoover book came out, my publisher Avalon Group basically went bankrupt and went into receivership. They were taken over by another publisher, another publishing company, but the other publishing company didn't have digital files of the books. So it made it extremely difficult for them to put out print-on-demand versions or electronic versions. So as a result, the book got stuck in that changing times. And so when I asked for the rights back, they were very happy to give them to me because my books were problematic that way. Once I got them back, I was able to recreate digital files for them by, I literally, for the 3 that were published in the 2000s, I found the most up-to-date Word file that I had handed into the publisher, mostly prior to copy editing, mm-hmm. and then had to simply work with them and get them up to their final form. For the Gold Ring, which was published in the 1980s, they were written on literally floppy disks when floppy disks were still floppy. So those had to be scanned and run through an optical display, OCR, optical character reader, which creates its own generation of typos. And so, but after a lot of work, I was able to create digital files for all 4 of them and design them into new editions. And now they're living a nice afterlife on Kindle and on Amazon as paperbacks. So I've stayed involved in the new age that way, and but I'm hoping I'm toying with a couple of ideas for books. I would love to get back into that. Life works in cycles, and I fully expect that cycle to come back.
In your estimation, what has been the lasting impact of Booknotes in the then contemporary American society and perhaps the subsequent times?
Well, I think we talked about this a little bit before. I think it very much changed the dynamics of book writing. It had an effect on the nonfiction book world similar to what C-SPAN's effect was on Congress, in that it brought it out into the public. It made writers come out from behind the curtain and face their audience. Not simply in small groups at bookstores, but a national audience. Booknotes in particular was a format where readers got to know writers in a new way. They got to see them as people. That television eye doesn't blink, as they say. You get to see the person. in a way that you don't normally see them. You get to know about their personal life, their writing habits, and it makes them more human.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that changes the book buying public?
Absolutely.
Do you think someone that has a personal relationship has seen someone on television that's obviously going to give them a different opinion of the book?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When you buy a book, you're buying. And sometimes you buy a book just because you like the topic, or you read a review and the review is good. But oftentimes you buy a book because it's by a writer that you like. Mm-hmm. I know I remember one study that I saw that said that book buyers are one of the most brand conscious groups of people. But the brand loyalty isn't to a publisher; it's to people like writers. They read a book by a person, and then if they like it, they buy another book by that person. And seeing a writer for an hour on TV and seeing them in a conversation, you get a sense about the person, and that, in a way, is the best form of marketing. And Booknotes and Book TV, which it was kind of the flagship of, really changed the way books are marketed today.
Is there anything else that you would like to add regarding Booknotes program, C-SPAN, or Brian Lamb?
Well, Brian Lamb has been one of my heroes in life for a while. I think what he did, and this comes both from my time working on Capitol Hill as well as my time as a book writer, so I think he's profoundly changed both institutions. When I started working on Capitol Hill, it was as a young lawyer in the 1970s. I worked for Senator Charles Percy, Republican of Illinois, on the Governmental Affairs Committee, and the U.S. Senate was a very different place. It was much more insulated. It was much more mysterious to the public. It was the only way you ever saw the Senate floor was to actually go there, sit in the gallery or sit on the floor if you were a staff member, and were able to do that. The rules were a mystery. Even to people who worked there, the rules were a mystery. But by bringing it out in the public, that public education has been invaluable in changing those institutions and making them more representative. And those institutions have a lot of other problems these days. It's common knowledge that they're very dysfunctional. But it's not because of C-SPAN. C-SPAN was the influence that made them more democratic and made them more accountable. And the way he has constantly pushed that envelope to bring C-SPAN cameras into more and more of what used to be the back rooms, the conference committees, the markup sessions, the caucus rooms, some of the fundraisers, the political meetings. Every step, I think, is extremely healthy and had a very good effect.
Bob, do you have any questions? I'm all through with my questions.
Okay.
And I want to make sure that you've said everything you've been wanting to say. And Mr. Ackerman, thank you for agreeing to do this oral history interview and for sharing with us your experience on this groundbreaking television interview program.
Well, thank you.
C-SPAN and Brian Lamb.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.